Welcome to the HCI family of podcasts. We're your source for personal, professional, and organizational growth and development. We share our own original research, explore industry trends, and interview executives and thought leaders from across the globe. Join us for practitioner-oriented content around all things leadership, HR, talent management, organizational development, and change management. Maximize your personal and organizational potential with the HCI family of podcasts. Lisa DeAngelis, welcome to the conversation today.
Thanks, John. It's great to be here.
It is a pleasure to be with you. You're joining us from Manhattan. I'm south of Salt Lake City in Utah. And today we're going to be talking about your recent book, Embracing the Unknown, Exploring the Pathways to Change. This is something I really think a lot about. I think a lot about organizational change. I think a lot about societal change. And your book touches on a variety of different forms of change, also individual and personal change. So we're going to try to unpack this a little bit and explore, change generally, how that applies into our lives, into our work, and why it's so important for us in this modern era of complexity and nuance and rapid disruption for us to lean into change and to be more and more comfortable with the constant change that's happening all around us. As we get started, I wanted to share Lisa's bio with everybody. Lisa DeAngelis is a holistic change practitioner, author, teacher, and speaker. She is passionate about building meaningful relationships and helping others live authentically. Her debut book, Embracing the Unknown, Exploring the Pathways to Change, offers research, wisdom, and aspirational stories that will empower and support others in learning to navigate change in their own lives. Lisa's own unfolding journey has established her commitment to living with intention and purpose and helping others walk through the meaningful intersections of their lives. An avid traveler, singer, and lover of the arts, Lisa lives and works in New York City. I have to ask, I always want guests to share anything else about themselves that they want the audience, to know about them. But I also have to ask about the singing. What kind of singing are you involved in? I'm a singer, an amateur singer. I sing in choirs and things like that. I always have since I was younger. I was a theater kid and sang in choirs, and I still do to this day. Just last night, I had a 2-hour rehearsal with my community choir. So, what kind of singing do you do?
That's so great. I was actually a classically trained singer. I did my undergraduate in voice, and
Nice.
was the direction I thought my life was going to go. And I lovingly at this point look back and say my life has been a series of best laid plans that did not, in fact, go according to best laid plans. And that was one of them. I knew very quickly I didn't want to pursue performing as a career. And that left me going, well, this is all I've done up till now. How do I pivot? And my professional career has been a series of pivot after pivot after pivot into
Mm,
some really interesting directions and spaces, which is probably one of the reasons I'm so interested in this topic of what it really means
yeah.
to change and not just making a decision, but really over the course of a life, over the course of time, and what that looks like to allow us to evolve as people.
Yeah, interesting. Well, you might have already started to share a little bit based on your personal evolution, but anything else you would like to share about your own background before we dive on in more broadly into the book?
I think the only thing I'd love to share is the sort of hilarious piece to this personal change side where I have so many people that I encounter that I will say, "Oh, that is such a great idea, but I don't really need that."
Hmm.
And it always makes me laugh because I think, gosh, if there is one constant in life, which of course we all know this phrase, the only constant in life is change, it's something we all have to deal with. But I just began to wonder why we have such a resistance to the topic, to the relationship of change with change, and to really dive into what it means to not only just deal with it and figure out some tools and resources, but how to embrace it. And the word embrace itself, I think, reflects kind of who I am and how I approach the world, because it's not just a resignation of some sort. It's really this moment of wrapping your arms around something and saying, I'm going to find a way to bring this into my life in a meaningful
Mm.
way that allows me to use it to grow.
Yeah. Well, you asked the question why. I mean, I think we all know it's human nature, right? Right. We tend to resist change. We tend to put up walls and We like things to be comfortable, consistent. We at least like to pretend like things are kind of consistent, that we have some control. And there's an evolutionary psychological reason for that, right? And through evolution, we're tribal. We would surround ourselves. We would try to protect ourselves. All of that leads to why we don't like change as a species. That's hard, though that's hardwired into our brains. If we can recognize that that is happening, in our hardwiring, we can also then learn to kind of set that aside, because the modern realities of the world we live in, it's different than, the flight or the fight or flight kind of realities that our predecessors might have been dealing with, when they literally, it was life and death to be dealing with things that were different. If they experienced new different things that they weren't familiar with, it literally could mean death for them, for their families, right? Today, we don't, that's not what change looks like for us, but we still have that kind of response mechanism, and
Yes.
so that's why we respond that way. And if we just recognize that, we don't need to have that same kind of visceral response, um, but we tend to. And so nobody again, nobody tends to like change. We're resistant to it. We like to at least feel like we have some sense of control, but it is a facade. Like the world is complex, it is messy, it's changing all around us all the time. There's disruption constantly, and we can kind of put our head in the sand and pretend like we have control, and pretend like, nothing's changing, or that we have security and stability, but really only to a certain extent. And honestly, unless we kind of lean into it and take charge of the type of change that's happening around us, we become victim to it rather than having control over the process.
Absolutely. And you hit on something really, really important are these barriers. Why change is actually so hard for people. And yes, you're correct. In our modern day world, we rarely encounter actual saber-toothed tigers that threaten our physical safety when we're out hunting and gathering for food. But our limbic brains do not know that. We
Yeah.
do not have an embodied understanding of the difference. Threat is threat is threat. And it always is perceived by our system as a threat to our safety. And it will cause us at some level to want to stick to the things we know that are tried and true and proven. But there's also research that shows that we can rewire those pieces of
Yeah.
our internal systems. We can become aware of our habits. We can learn to make different choices, but we don't know what we don't know. And we have to bring that up to our awareness first. Otherwise, we are just stuck in these loops and these patterns. You bring up something really interesting that actually I think is more present than we realize, which is this concept of tribal shaming that happened way, way, way back when, because it did actually threaten the health and safety of a tribe if anyone left or didn't fulfill their very narrow role in the group functioning and dynamic. But nothing changes unless something changes. And so people did have to break away, and sometimes they were shamed. They were actually pushed out of being in the tribe. But that is how progress eventually happens, is it takes that courage to step away. It takes these kind of deep inbred skills drawn out of us to pull us into something new, to chart new territory and forge new pathways. And so we are doing versions of that at every moment. It's not as do or die as it may have been in a much, much, much older survival situation, but our bodies don't always know the difference. So this is where it becomes really important to bring this into our open awareness. I was really surprised when I first started researching for my book because there is a ton of research on organizational change and business
Yeah.
change. There are tons of models, there are tons of resources. There's almost nothing on personal change. And
Mm.
if you think about it, it makes sense. Everybody's journey is different, it's all individual. There are so many different levels. We could talk about change at the most minuscule level or the most massive. But there's very little that has been distilled on what to do. So, where does that leave us? And we can draw from some of these organizational change methods as a starting point, but I think we need to recognize that we are the X factor, right? We can't control ourselves the way we might be able to control conditions in a business situation. generation, but we are the key part of what creates constant evolution for ourselves in whatever way we show up, whether that's our professional life, our personal life, or just whatever we do as a passion or hobby.
Yeah, yeah. I love that. And one thing that it just reminds me, like because of the hardwiring and the rewiring that takes work, right? Because we're not naturally inclined towards change. Like it really, and the tribal shaming and like just all of that, like it takes work and it takes courage. It takes courage to be open to change. And I'm just thinking of like within my own family line, as you were talking about the tribal shaming piece, and not that far back, like my own grandfather. I'm thinking, the family stories about how he was the first to kind of break away. He left the family farm. He was disowned for leaving the family farm to go off to college. He was the first one to go to college. He was disowned. His parents refused at that point to go to his wedding. They never really talked to him again because he went to college, but he kind of set that. He became an educator. He set his family then on that trajectory. My father then, went to college, became an educator and a therapist. I went to college, right? So, like simple things like that, only a couple generations ago in my own family, of someone taking, like, having the courage to do what they felt was needful, for themselves, their own authenticity, their own purpose. Um, that's hard, especially like when it's your family, and
Oh,
you
yeah.
don't get to choose how people respond to your choices. And so I'm sure that my grandfather would never have wanted that kind of a response. I'm sure he was devastated, and I'm sure it was heartbreaking. But ultimately, he can't choose that. He can't own the way other people respond. All he can do is make the choices that he's going to make for his own life. And it took courage, and he did it, and he lived a great life, and he set up his family for a different path, right? Um, that's just one small example, but we have, all of us have all these types of examples in our own lives, in our own family histories. We look back on our communities, in our organizations. We have all of these types of examples, and I think any change of any significance takes tremendous courage.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. That's a great example. And I will say that we can't invalidate the secondhand safety that we receive from watching other people successfully do it and take steps
Mhm.
forward. It's one of the reasons a good leader who leads um, through change, through adversity, through challenges can be such a beacon for their business, their organization, their employees, their circles, their spheres, because when we observe other people doing these things, taking courageous steps forward, showing adaptability, examples of resilience that show up, it actually creates the ability for each of us to do the same in our lives just by observing that. And I think that's something that we easily forget, right? And we don't live in a culture where we often celebrate these things as much as we should. We're wired for negativity bias, right? It's much easier for us to track the negative things and forget to celebrate the positive things. But that's actually how we change the patterns. I've started referring to this as sort of developing proof loops of the times
Mhm.
we have done things when they're difficult, when we can really establish this moment of saying, oh, that was an unknown. That was something I did not know how to do yet. And I took a step forward. I didn't die. I'm still here. And there was a positive result. And so if we can wire that in to say, oh no, this isn't something I haven't done before. I actually have done this over and over and over again. But if we miss that step of really helping to rewire in that proof, it eliminates the possibility that we can then use it as an additional resource.
Yeah. And that secondary benefit, that secondary effect that you were just talking about, if you'll humor me for a moment, I'll share one more quick family
Sure.
example. I just shared one about my grandfather, now my father. Um, Again, an act of courage, an act of tremendous change that actually didn't work out all that well for him career wise, but it was a signal, and it was something that taught me tremendously. That definitely has had an impact on me. So he made a career change, probably about actually around the same age I am now. So I was a teenager at the time, so I was very aware of it as it was happening because it had big impact on my family. He left a very stable, secure job, and he kind of broke out on his own as an entrepreneur. And um, for a variety of reasons, but ultimately, he just felt like what he was doing was a bit stifling. He felt like he had more potential. He felt like, he had more creative juices, et cetera, right? And ultimately, it wasn't all that successful. And there were challenges. Entrepreneurship is hard. Starting your own business is hard. We could talk about that forever and ever. Um, but the lesson I learned from that is his willingness to do something incredibly hard, incredibly courageous, and that we were okay. Like we went from being, yeah, we weren't like well off. We were like firmly kind of probably lower middle class, but very comfortable and very stable. We went from that point to being pretty darn dirt poor. But you know what? We were still totally fine. Like, even though we were very dirt poor, we were totally fine. And learning that we were totally fine and that we could still get by and that we could come together as a family and support each other, that was a huge life lesson. And seeing the courage of my father and my mother supporting him and seeing us all come together, that was a life lesson that has stayed with me uh, for forever, right? And so
Mhm.
those secondary effects, like you were describing, I only hear the stories of my grandfather, which I'm sure impacted my father, which then influenced how he made some of those types of decisions, which certainly have impacted me and have probably led to some of the types of decisions that I've made. So the willingness to embrace tremendous transformational change in personal life, as evidence from my grandfather to my father, have definitely trickled down to me, and I hope they trickle down to my children. We can't discount the impact of that.
No, and you brought up the word resilience a few times, so I want to just cycle back to that. As I mentioned, when I was doing research for my book, I was at first I was struggling to figure out, okay, how do I build in research? How do I get people to connect with how this really applies to our lives? So I started going really out of the box, and I found a fascinating research study on resilience in social infrastructure in ant colonies, in insect systems.
Interesting.
And I thought, okay, now this is right up my alley, right? Like, okay, what do ants have to teach us about resilience, right? So they did this study showing how colonies of ants responded to disruption, right? And there
Hmm.
were three main ways that the colonies responded. One of them was to invest in strong infrastructure to begin with, so they could be
Hmm.
as resistant to the disruption as possible, right? And in the face of a threat, other colonies could quickly redirect energy and resources to sort of, put things where they're needed, hold this, go here, and really kind of put things where they were necessary to do that. And there was a third group that they just basically let it burn down and focused on the rebuilding. And
Hmm.
I thought, wow, there is something really interesting there for us to consider. What does it look like to build your layers of resilience to allow for any of these types of situations to arise in your life where you are not so thrown off by disruption where you feel like you have no options? Because it's really never that we don't have choices. It's just we have to let go of our controlled outcome of what we thought it was going to be. And regardless of whether or not you've invested in infrastructure in order to be as resilient proof as possible, disruption proof as possible, and as resilient from the get-go, or you're just really adept at pivoting quickly, or you just say, you know what, this is an opportunity to rebuild. There's something to be learned from that I think is really, really fascinating when we build this in. And along with courage and adaptability, I frame them adaptability, resilience, and courage so I can call them my tool arc, because
Hmm.
like anything we need for change, this is a process that is not fixed and we need flexible tools. We can't have static tools that only work in one situation. We can't depend on things that are so conditional that they don't work unless everything is in its perfect place. We need flexible,
Yeah.
adaptable tools that we can apply. And these are the same skill sets that are actually the tough to teach intangibles that are most valued increasingly in the workplace. Is
Yeah.
because they're hard to teach. It's not that we don't have them. And I think that's the trick. We don't need to teach them, we need to strengthen them. We all have experienced a version of what it's like to be adaptable, what it's like to be resilient. Elastic is a version of the resilience definition that I really love. It's our elasticity as a person, or
Mhm.
even courage. And I make a joke, my brother-in-law is a firefighter. He literally runs into burning buildings to save people. That's a different type of courage than I display when I go outside my comfort zone and I'm more visible than I'm comfortable being, or I show up in a way that is unfamiliar to me. But courage is not conditional. It is something that exists for us no matter how it shows up.
Yeah. And being able to practice that courage, right? Or practicing
Yes.
that authenticity is just really important. Let's talk a little bit more about the authenticity piece.
Yeah, sure.
Because that's something, again, coming back to my own family examples, that's something that I see in my grandfather, I see in my father, this hyper authenticity. They're just, it's really core to who they are. When I see people who are really willing to lean into change, whether that's personal change, organizational, institutional change, they're really committed to authenticity. But that's scary in and of itself because there's vulnerability there. Um, Talk to us more about what you mean by that and like how that's so important to change.
For me, this idea of authenticity has been thrown around as a little bit of a buzzword, right? It's like I'm
Hmm.
being authentic, but I think authenticity is this state where in order to be true to something, we have to be in touch with it. And so it is this constant ability to be in touch with our system, a cycle. It's not something fixed. I'm being authentic. I'm not being authentic. Authentic is this spectrum of displaying the fullness of who we are, knowing that it's always constantly influenced by what we're working with, which I think is so cool. I mean, the reality is any type of growth requires some type of friction. So being authentic does not mean showing up happy or showing up that it means honoring where you actually are. And
Yeah.
sometimes it means admitting vulnerability. Sometimes it means saying, I don't know the answer to this. And that's not always comfortable, especially in a world where we think the answers are what it's about. I'm really in favor of this ideal of seeking the questions over looking for
Hmm.
the answers, because I think it leads us to much more interesting places. But at its core, I think authenticity is this commitment to honoring where we are at any given moment and allowing for that to inform our next step. And that, I think, for me, is a really big piece of how this loops back in. I've learned huge lessons about authenticity from my work with horses, and I've
Mm.
done equine informed leadership and life work, and they have the inability to hide what they're experiencing, and they don't display it with judgment. So what's fascinating to me is that they don't care what you're feeling. They just don't want you to be incongruent. If
Mm.
you're scared and you pretend you aren't scared, they don't trust you.
Mm.
They need you to show up as you are. They don't care if you're scared. It actually makes them feel better for you to be honest with yourself. And to me, that's the most beautiful mirror of authenticity I've been able to actually experience, because it unlocks this whole new world of saying, my work in being authentic with you is not to be false because I think it's what's right. It's really tuning in and understanding what's actually happening in me so I can show up most fully.
Yeah, I love that. Well, Lisa, this has just been a super fun conversation. The time has flown by. I note the time and
I
I need to let you go because you have a busy day. But before we wrap things up, I just wanted to give you a chance to share with the audience how they can connect with you, find out more about your work, let them know where they can find your book, and then give us a final word on the topic for today.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you. So, my book again is Embracing the Unknown, Exploring the Pathways to Change. You can find it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Target.com, anywhere online where you can find books, or on my website, which is just my name, www.lisadeangelis.com. I'd love for you to connect with me on socials, and I would really love to give your listeners, John, a 99-cent copy of my ebook. So, we'll set up a promo code and include that with the show notes, and I look forward to sharing my message with the world. I think if I was going to end sort of with one thought, one thing, it's that, I think a lot of times we feel like we don't have the power to choose. But the power to choose and our freedom to choose, I think, is one of our greatest gifts. And so to support ourselves and the people in our circles, our communities, our businesses, our organizations with these skills is one of the most valuable gifts we can provide to build our human capital in the world. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things is human capital is something that its impact is really greater than the sum of its parts. And I think we have the opportunity to do that every time we move forward, even when it's difficult, even when it's hard, and even when we don't know what's ahead. It's a gift.
I love it. It is a gift. Lisa, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. I encourage the audience to reach out, to get connected, find out more about what Lisa can do for you. Check out her book. And as always, I hope everyone can stay healthy and safe, that you can find meaning and purpose at work each and every day. And I hope you all have a great week. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the podcast. We hope you stay healthy and safe, and please join us again soon.